you thought medieval times were all gallant knights, courtly love, and enchanting ladies fluttering handkerchiefs from impossibly high castle windows, their perfect hair cascading like a golden waterfall? Bless your naive modern heart. You've been watching too many documentaries filmed by people who clearly never had to empty a chamber pot in the dead of winter, or who think romance involves a lack of basic plumbing and a constant low-level fear of dysentery. Let's disabuse you of that utterly ludicrous notion, shall we? You're about to embark on a journey not of chivalric fantasy, but of unadulterated, historically accurate, and profoundly inconvenient truth. Because today, my delightfully unsuspecting friend, we're not here to discuss queens, saints, or even particularly industrious peasants who managed to avoid the plague for an impressive amount of time. Oh no, we're drilling down into a very specific, very thorny, and utterly unglamorous corner of medieval life. What it was like to be a medieval mistress. And I'm going to tell you, with the kind of meticulous detail usually reserved for a really boring tax audit, that it was not only unromantic, but a special kind of protracted, miserable purgatory, perfect for lulling you into a deep, existential dread sleep. Think of it as ASMR for the historically cynical. My purpose here today is not to provide you with heartwarming tales of forbidden love against a backdrop of flickering torchlight. If that's what you're after, I suggest you consult a very specific, deeply fictionalized subgenre of historical romance novels. No, my objective is far more noble, far more important, and arguably far more depressing. We are here to systematically, meticulously, and with the surgical precision of a medieval barber surgeon, dismantle any lingering romanticized ideals of the role. We will do this one agonizing historical fact at a time, until any notion of a medieval mistress being anything other than a high-risk, low-reward gamble with a terrible payout is utterly obliterated from your psyche. You'll thank me later, or you'll hate me. Either way, you'll be more accurately informed, and frankly, that's all I truly care about. So let me be abundantly clear. This isn't a romantic historical deep dive. This isn't a gentle exploration of the complexities of human relationships in a bygone era. This is the historical equivalent of watching a medieval tax audit, but with more social ostracism, the constant threat of public humiliation, and a significantly higher chance of contracting something utterly horrific from your beloved. You are about to become intimately acquainted with the unsexy, unforgiving reality of being a medieval mistress, a role that promised fleeting dazzle, but delivered a lifetime of precariousness. So settle in, get comfortable, perhaps grab a cushion for your impending despair, and prepare to have your romantic illusions about the past systematically disemboweled. Metaphorically, of course. Mostly. Now, let's peel back the thin, flimsy veneer of the term mistress, shall we? Because in the modern mind, it often conjures images of a clandestine, passionate affair, a secret rendezvous, whispers in the dark, stolen moments of illicit pleasure, maybe a tastefully appointed, discreet pied-à-terre. Oh, you sweet summer child. In the medieval era, the term mistress was less about a torrid fling and more about a surprisingly long-term, quasi-official, and utterly precarious contractual arrangement with an expiration date etched in the stone of your inevitable decline. This wasn't a casual hookup you could swipe away from. This was often a deeply entrenched, albeit unsanctioned, fixture in a powerful man's life, right up until it wasn't. We're talking about a position that carried a certain public visibility, a grudging, often contemptuous, acceptance within a narrow social circle. You weren't just a secret kept in the shadows. You were an open secret, a tolerated accessory, a persistent rumor made flesh and blood. And that visibility, that pseudo-official status, was a double-edged sword. It might have granted you a sliver of temporary access to a world of privilege, but it simultaneously branded you, marked you, and permanently relegated you to a social netherworld. It bought you silks today, but ensured rags tomorrow. So who exactly was signing up for this particular brand of historical misery? Who became a mistress in an age where a woman's virtue was often her most valuable, if not her only asset? Well, it wasn't exactly a career path advertised in the local guild hall. Often, these were women with terrifyingly limited options. We're talking about lower gentry daughters whose families couldn't scrape together a decent dowry, leaving them unmarriageable. Orphaned ladies cast adrift in a brutal world, or those simply desperate, staring down the barrel of abject poverty, hunger, and societal invisibility. When your choices are starve gracefully in an alley, or become the kept woman of a powerful, capricious lord with questionable hygiene, suddenly that second option starts to look like a pragmatic, albeit morally dubious, rung on a very short, rickety ladder. It's either this or the convent, darling, they might have whispered to themselves, probably with a grimace. And at least this has silks, for now. It was less a choice and more a strategic retreat from the truly unbearable. And let's be absolutely clear about the power dynamics at play here. This wasn't a partnership. This wasn't a mutually beneficial arrangement between consenting adults with equal standing. Oh no, that's a modern fantasy. This was an inherent, inescapable, and utterly suffocating power imbalance. A relationship where one party held all the cards, and I mean all of them. The man, whether he was a minor baron or a mighty king, was the absolute arbiter of your fate. He held your financial well-being, your social standing, what little there was, your future, and quite often, the very roof over your head, firmly in the palm of his hand. He might occasionally, in a moment of fleeting affection or strategic calculation, throw you a fancy bone, a jeweled brooch, a small cottage, a pretty new gown. But make no mistake, that bone was tethered to him, and the leash was around your neck. You were less a lover and more a very expensive, very decorative pet. Now, let's contrast that delightful predicament with the situation of the legitimate wife. Because even a medieval wife, however downtrodden, however neglected, however much she longed to bash her philandering husband over the head with a heavy, gilded candlestick, had some legal standing. She had dower rights, property rights, the backing of her family, and a societal position that, while restrictive, was undeniably legitimate. She was the foundation of the household, the vessel for legitimate heirs, the keeper of the family honor. She was a recognized, indispensable part of the social and legal fabric. A mistress, on the other hand? Zip, nada, nil. She was a ghost in the machine, a temporary fixture, a disposable asset. When the storm came, the wife had a stone fortress, however leaky. The mistress? She had a very pretty, very precarious sandcastle at high tide. All right, let's talk about the perks, shall we? Because every precarious situation needs a shiny distraction, a thin veneer of glitter to mask the underlying dread. And for the medieval mistress, these benefits often came in the form of lavish gifts and what appeared, to the untrained eye, to be a rather comfortable existence. You might find yourself adorned in silks that shimmered like captured starlight, draped in jewels that winked with stolen fire, perhaps even gifted a small house, complete with a garden and servants. Oh, look, a shiny object, a pretty bauble, a cozy little nest, all your own, for now. But don't be fooled, my dear historical voyeur. This wasn't liberation. This was a diamond collar on a chained dog, a gilded cage designed to distract you from the fact that you were, in fact, still very much chained. These were the trappings of luxury, yes, but they were also the very visible symbols of your utter dependence. Each shimmering gown, each sparkling gem, each comfortable pillow was a reminder of who provided it, and therefore who owned you. It was a tangible, material tether, a beautiful leash. And while you might have momentarily enjoyed the envious glances of less fortunate women, those glances were invariably tinged with a heavy dose of scorn and judgment. Because everyone knew the true cost of those silks. Everyone understood the unspoken transaction behind every lavish gift. It wasn't generosity. It was an investment in your continued compliance and availability. For a fleeting, intoxicating moment, you might have experienced a taste of temporary elevation. You might have found yourself at court, amidst the rustle of finery and the murmur of intrigue, attending feasts where jesters capered and minstrels sang. You might have seen the powerful, the privileged, the genuinely legitimate, up close and personal. But you were always an outsider. You were a tolerated accessory, a decorative add-on to the main event, never a true participant. Your presence was grudgingly accepted, perhaps even expected, but never celebrated. You were an exotic bird in a gilded cage, brought out for display, but never truly free to fly amongst the legitimate flock. You were the luxury SUV parked in front of a cathedral, impressive, but ultimately not invited inside for the sermon. The man provided, it's true. He filled your coffers, kept your belly full, and ensured you had a roof that mostly didn't leak. And in a world where destitution was a breath away for many, this provision was certainly a powerful draw. But this provision was a leash, not a liberation. It was a golden chain, not a key to freedom. Your entire existence became predicated on his continued affection, his current whim, his fleeting fancy. One bad mood, one younger, prettier face, one moment of political expediency, and that provision could evaporate faster than a medieval doctor's good intentions. You were utterly, absolutely, existentially dependent on him. Your comfort, your safety, your very next meal all hung precariously on the slender thread of his continued, ephemeral interest. It was less financial security and more a very high-stakes, indefinite subscription service that he could cancel without notice. And perhaps the most insidious perk that was never actually a perk was the complete absence of independent wealth. Any wealth you accumulated, any property you were given, any jewels you adorned yourself with were tied directly to your lover's current mood, and, more crucially, his continued existence. There were no trust funds for you, my dear, no independently managed portfolios, No separate bank accounts with a cunningly hidden offshore component. The moment he died, or more likely, the moment he simply grew bored and moved on, all of it, every last shimmering thread of silk, every gleaming facet of a jewel, could be, and often was, stripped away. You are building a very elaborate, very beautiful sandcastle, entirely at the mercy of the next tide. It was a financial house of cards, built on the shifting sands of male caprice, and it was always one gust of wind away from tumbling down into the abyss. Now, let's talk about the delightful social climate that awaited our medieval mistress. Forget your quaint notions of scandal as a whispered rumor. In the medieval era, being a mistress was less a private indiscretion and more a public service announcement of your moral failings, broadcast across the village square without the benefit of a loudspeaker, but with significantly more impact. Even if the relationship was quasi-official, even if your lord openly acknowledged you, it was rarely truly accepted. Society knew. And society, with its relentless, unforgiving judgment, absolutely, unequivocally condemned. You wore a scarlet letter, my friend, not literally sewn onto your tunic, but stamped invisibly and indelibly upon your very existence. And trust me, it was way more uncomfortable than a bit of fancy embroidery. You might be thinking, but surely, if she was powerful, if she had the Lord's favor, people would respect her? Oh, you sweet, deluded optimist. They might have feared her, yes. They might have paid her lip service, nodded deferentially, even sought her influence. But respect? True, genuine respect? That was a privilege reserved for the legitimately married, the virtuous, the untainted. For the mistress, it was a constant, gnawing humiliation. Every glance was a judgment. Every whispered conversation was about her. Her presence in any decent gathering was a disturbance, an affront to moral sensibilities. You were the walking, breathing embodiment of sin, and medieval society, fueled by the omnipresent dread of damnation, had absolutely no tolerance for that. And the community condemnation was a relentless, pervasive force, like a perpetual low-grade fever that never quite broke. You were shunned by decent society, especially the women who might have once been your friends, or who now saw you as a threat, an insult, or both. Imagine walking into a bustling market, and as you approach, conversations abruptly cease. Children are subtly but firmly pulled closer to their mothers. Eye contact is avoided, or if made, it's laced with a potent cocktail of pity, scorn, and self-righteousness. Oh, look, it's her. You could almost hear the thoughts reverberating through the cobbled streets. Don't make eye contact, children. Don't engage. She's tainted. You were not just an outcast. You were a public health hazard, morally speaking. Then there was the church. Oh, the church, that ever-present, all-seeing eye of medieval morality, with its heavy hand and its even heavier pronouncements on eternal damnation. Your very existence as a mistress was a constant, egregious affront to God, to Scripture, to the holy sacrament of marriage. You were living in a state of mortal sin, a walking, breathing anathema. The threat of excommunication wasn't some distant, abstract theological concept. It was a terrifying, tangible reality. Imagine being denied the sacraments, the very keys to salvation in a deeply religious age. Imagine knowing that every breath you took, every indulgence you enjoyed, was dragging you deeper into the fiery pits of hell. It was a daily dose of existential dread, a spiritual albatross hung firmly around your neck, whispering promises of eternal torment with every luxurious rustle of your sinful silks. And if that wasn't enough to curdle your blood, consider the profound shame you brought upon your own family. Because while you might have been temporarily elevated by your Lord's favor, your family was simultaneously being dragged through the mud. Your choices could potentially ruin marriage prospects for your sisters, effectively tainting them by association. It could lower their social standing, diminish their dowries, and mark them as the kin of that woman. Your father, if he still acknowledged you, would likely walk with a permanent stoop of humiliation. Your mother would grieve for the daughter she had lost, not to death, but to dishonor. You weren't just risking your own soul, you were putting a massive, indelible stain on your entire lineage, a social black mark that would outlive you and continue to haunt your descendants for generations. It was a family-sized serving of shame, and you were the chef. Now, let's venture into the truly fun part of being a medieval mistress, the delightful legal vacuum that constituted her existence. Imagine having absolutely no rights. None. Zip. Nada. Nil. You existed outside the legal framework, a ghost in the system, a glitch in the matrix of medieval jurisprudence. You had no dower rights, meaning when your lover inevitably kicked the bucket, you had no legal claim to any portion of his estate, unlike his legitimate wife, who was guaranteed a share. You had no inheritance rights, meaning you couldn't expect to be named in his will beyond perhaps a token, easily contested and probably insulting some. You had no legal claim to your own children, who, in the eyes of the law and society, belonged to no one, or rather, to their father if he deigned to acknowledge them. And most critically, you had absolutely no protection from eviction, abandonment, or any other capricious cruelty your lover might decide to inflict upon you. You were, legally speaking, a highly aesthetic void. And speaking of children, let's talk about the grim reality of bastardy in the medieval era. Because any child born to a mistress was, by definition, a child of sin, an illegitimate issue, a stain on the lineage. Their legal non-existence mirrored their mother's. They had no claim to their father's title, lands, or wealth. They couldn't inherit. They couldn't truly belong. For a boy, this meant a life without the prospects of noble advancement, forever relegated to the periphery. For a girl, it meant even fewer options than a legitimate daughter, often destined for the convent, if they were lucky, or, grimly, following their mother's path into precarious dependence. They were born into a societal cul-de-sac, branded from birth, and forever looking up at a ceiling of opportunity that legitimate society had built without them. Their only real chance at advancement was through the extraordinary grace of a powerful father who chose to acknowledge and support them, a rare and fragile lifeline indeed. Then there's the ever-present sword of Damocles hanging over your beautifully coiffed head, eviction at a whim. Imagine this: one bad mood from your lord, one political reversal, one new, shinier fascination, and you could be summarily cast out. No notice, no severance, no thank you for your service. Just a brusque command to pack your bags, darling. The new model is arriving. You might be stripped of everything: the house, the jewels, the silks. What was given with a grand gesture could be rescinded with a flick of the wrist. You went from silk sheets to the cold, unforgiving cobbles in a single, devastating moment. Your entire existence was a theatrical performance, and the curtain could drop on your act at any second, leaving you exposed and utterly destitute. It was like living in a luxury Airbnb, but the owner could kick you out for a bad Yelp review or just because he found a better tenant, with zero legal recourse for you. And to really put a cap on this delightful portrait of legal and social invisibility, let's consider the comparison to prostitution. Now, for many medieval mistresses, especially those lower down the social ladder, her position wasn't far removed from that of a common prostitute, at least in the eyes of the law and much of society. The key difference was often longevity and the potential for a slightly better wardrobe. A prostitute offered services for a fee on a transactional basis. A mistress offered companionship and sexual services on a more extended but equally precarious transactional basis, often with an added layer of emotional entanglement that made the inevitable abandonment even more brutal. Both were morally condemned, both lacked legal protection, and both were vulnerable to exploitation and destitution. The mistress simply had a slightly larger, slightly more comfortable waiting room for the inevitable social guillotine. All right, now let's introduce the wild card, the unpredictable element, the person whose simmering rage could ignite your entire precarious existence into a roaring inferno, the legitimate wife. Because while the mistress was busy fluttering her borrowed finery and enjoying her temporary elevation, the wife was often stewing in a castle, seething with a righteous indignation that, while inconvenient for the mistress, was entirely understandable. And despite her own limitations in a patriarchal society, the wife had power. She had family connections, significant legal standing as the lady of the house, and sometimes a very sharp implement at her disposal, and she was not afraid to use any or all of them. The legitimate wife's vengeance was a force to be reckoned with. She might not have been able to directly challenge her husband, especially a powerful one, but the mistress? Oh, the mistress was fair game. She was the convenient, disposable target for all the wife's suppressed fury and humiliation. You were the walking, breathing embodiment of her husband's betrayal, a public affront to her honor and her family's legacy. And she would make her displeasure known, often in ways that ranged from subtly terrifying to overtly homicidal. Imagine living every day knowing that a woman with legitimate authority over her household, significant family backing, and a potent sense of grievance considered you her sworn enemy. That's a stress test for the nervous system, my friends. So, what were her methods of retaliation? Well, they varied. At the milder end of the spectrum, you might face public shaming. The wife could spread rumors, orchestrate social snubs, and ensure that your name was dragged through every conceivable muddy puddle. She could use her influence to turn the entire court or village against you, making your social isolation even more profound. More acutely, she could initiate character assassination, painting you as a calculating Jezebel, a witch, or a harlot, stripping away any shred of dignity or perceived innocence. But let's not forget the more hands-on approaches. Historical records are replete with tales of wives making their displeasure known through very real threats of violence. We're talking about direct confrontations, physical assaults, or even, in the darkest corners of history, poison. Because when societal norms failed, a very strong dose of medieval practicality often kicked in. It was a game of cat and mouse, but the mouse had no rights, and the cat had a very, very sharp set of claws. Even if the wife wasn't actively plotting your demise with a suspiciously strong herbal tea, her quiet resentment was a constant, soul-crushing pressure. The icy stares, the pointed comments, the refusal to acknowledge your presence, the way she might subtly undermine your standing with servants or other courtiers. These were not flashy, dramatic acts, but a steady drip, drip, drip of psychological torment. It was the social equivalent of being constantly bombarded by passive-aggressive emails, but with far higher stakes and the ever-present threat of a medieval reply all that could end your life. This silent disapproval and the subsequent alienation from court or social circles was a suffocating blanket of misery that even the finest silks couldn't alleviate. It made every social interaction a minefield. And here's the brutal truth. The truly terrifying aspect for our mistress? She had absolutely no one to protect her from a legitimately enraged spouse. Her lover, the man who theoretically provided her with everything, was unlikely to intervene forcefully against his legitimate wife. Why? Because the wife was the mother of his legitimate heirs, the keeper of his household, the linchpin his family's honor and alliances. His relationship with her was foundational to his social and political standing. The mistress, on the other hand, was an expendable dalliance. He might offer token protest, a mild rebuke, or even a fleeting moment of pity, but he would not risk his entire world for a woman who was, ultimately, just a temporary distraction. So, when the wife came knocking, or stabbing, the mistress was utterly, terrifyingly alone. You were on your own, darling, and good luck with that. All right, let's talk about the biological consequences of this utterly miserable arrangement, shall we? Because few things underscored the sheer, unadulterated suckage of being a medieval mistress quite like having children. And not just any children, but little bastards, a term that in the medieval era was less a playground taunt and more a legal, social, and spiritual condemnation of the highest order. These children, born out of wedlock, faced a life of profound disadvantage. They were stained from birth with the indelible mark of illegitimacy, a brand that condemned them to a future bereft of inheritance, severely limited social mobility, and constant, pervasive stigma. Imagine being born into a world where your very existence was considered an affront to God and man. That's a pretty heavy burden to place on an infant. Their entire future was a tightrope walk over a chasm of nothingness. They had no legal claim to their father's name, lands, or wealth. They were effectively non-persons in the eyes of the law, their birth a legal anomaly. For a boy, this meant no inheritance of titles, no access to ancestral estates, no guaranteed place in the noble hierarchy. He might be educated, even trained in arms, but he would forever be a dependent, a satellite circling a star he could never truly reach. His prospects were limited to the church, military service as a mercenary, or perhaps a lower-level administrative role, always at the whim of others. For a girl, the situation was even grimmer. Her primary asset, her virtue, was already compromised by her birth. Her chances of a respectable marriage, even a modest one, were severely diminished. often leading to a life in a convent, if they could afford the dowry for entry, or, with a chilling historical repetition, following their mother's precarious path. And let's not forget the sheer, unmitigated burden of sole responsibility. While the father might occasionally acknowledge his illegitimate offspring, provide some sporadic financial support, or even take a passing interest in their education, child-rearing often fell entirely and overwhelmingly to the mistress. She was the primary caregiver, the sole source of emotional support, the one who bore the brunt of societal judgment for her children of sin. This was without the consistent, legally bound support available to a legitimate wife. Imagine trying to raise a child, or several, in an age of rampant disease, high infant mortality, and constant economic insecurity, all while navigating the social minefield of your own precarious existence. This burden was amplified tenfold if the father lost interest, moved on to a new mistress, or, most terrifyingly, died, leaving her and her children utterly destitute and unprotected. The limited futures these children faced were a constant, crushing weight on the mother's heart. She knew, with agonizing certainty, that her choices had fundamentally disadvantaged her offspring. She bore the guilt, the fear, and the heartbreak of watching her sons struggle against an invisible wall, seeing her daughter's prospects wither before they even bloomed. These children were a living, breathing testament to her moral transgression, a constant reminder of her precarious position and the devastating consequences of her choices. It wasn't just her life that was ruined, it was theirs too, and that knowledge was often more torturous than any public shaming. The emotional burden of being a mother to little bastards was immense. The gnawing guilt, the terrifying fear of what would become of them, the heartbreak of knowing they would never truly belong. These were the unseen, often unrecorded, torments of the medieval mistress. She carried not just her own shame, but the future of her stigmatized children, often alone and without recourse. Every hungry cry, every unanswered question about their father, every cold glance from society was a fresh wound. It was a love laced with profound sorrow, a maternal bond forged in the crucible of societal condemnation. And it was a misery that transcended even the most lavish of gilded cages, seeping into the very core of her being. All right, if the social and legal precariousness hasn't sufficiently dampened your medieval romance fantasies, let's dive into the delightful realm of medieval health risks. Because for our mistress, her intimate relationship came with a constant, terrifying threat: medieval STIs. Oh, what a gift that kept on giving. Without antibiotics, without even a basic understanding of germ theory, a simple infection from your lover could mean disfigurement, agony, blindness, mental deterioration, or a slow, agonizing death. Syphilis, gonorrhea, chancroid, these weren't just embarrassing inconveniences. They were life sentences of suffering, often ending in a horrific demise. Imagine your skin erupting in ulcers, your hair falling out in clumps, your mind slowly deteriorating, all while society actively blamed you for your sinful condition. It was a truly delightful souvenir from your paramour. And speaking of bodily horrors, let's talk about childbirth. Childbirth in the medieval era was perilous for all women. Maternal and infant mortality rates were astronomical. The delivery room was less a room and more a potential death trap, with questionable hygiene, rudimentary medical knowledge, and interventions that often did more harm than good. But for a mistress, oh, it was a special kind of nightmare fuel. She often lacked the resources, the skilled midwives, or the robust support network available to legitimate wives. A noble wife would have a retinue of attendants, perhaps even a physician, and the absolute best care her husband's wealth could buy. A mistress might be relegated to a less reputable midwife in a smaller, less hygienic dwelling, with fewer people truly invested in her survival or the child's. This meant even higher maternal and infant mortality rates, a truly terrifying prospect when every pregnancy was a roll of the biological dice. And should she fall ill, whether from a virulent infection or the rigors of childbirth, there was absolutely no such thing as sick leave. Her primary asset, her very being, was tied to her desirability, her ability to please, her continued health and beauty. Illness meant a rapid decline in desirability, a sudden loss of appeal. A lord looking for a companion, a decorative accessory, wasn't interested in a woman racked by fever, covered in sores, or weakened by a difficult birth. Illness meant a high chance of being discarded without a second thought, replaced by a healthier, more vibrant model. You were a product. And if you stopped working, you were simply replaced. No warranty, no return policy, no sympathy. The medieval equivalent of being ghosted, but with added pus and imminent destitution. Beyond the physical ravages, let's not overlook the profound mental health fallout of this existence. Imagine the crushing isolation, the constant stress of knowing your entire world could collapse at any moment, the terrifying fear of abandonment, and the daily grind of social pariah status. This cocktail of existential dread would lead to profound psychological distress, anxiety, depression, paranoia, chronic stress. These weren't diagnoses, but the unacknowledged realities of a life lived on the fringes, under constant scrutiny and utterly devoid of true security or respect. There was no medieval therapy, no support groups, no self-help books filled with empowering affirmations. Just you, your anxieties, and the terrifying silence of your gilded cage. You were likely not just adorning yourself with fine clothes, but also with a thick, suffocating blanket of misery and fear. So, while you might have envisioned soft fabrics and candlelit dinners, the reality was often a much grittier tableau. The smell of fear, the dull ache of a persistent illness, the festering sores of an STI, the terrifying pain of childbirth alone, and the crushing weight of existential loneliness. The silks and jewels were merely a distraction from the biological realities of a brutal, unforgiving era, and the emotional toll of a life lived as a beautiful, disposable object. It was a pretty rotten hand, dealt with a cruel smirk by fate. Now, for arguably the most insidious, soul-crushing terror of being a medieval mistress, the relentless march of time. Because in this particular profession, youth was your primary, and often your only valuable asset. It was your currency, your leverage, your very reason for being. Once that youthful bloom began to fade, once the first telltale lines etched themselves around your eyes, once your figure began to soften in ways not celebrated by medieval aesthetics, then so did your value. Darling, your lord might not have said directly, but the sentiment would be conveyed through increasingly distant glances and dwindling gifts. Your face is starting to resemble a particularly well-trodden prune. It's time for a younger model. This was the next model syndrome, an inevitable, brutal reality that haunted every mistress from the moment she first caught her lord's eye. You were easily replaced by younger, fresher faces without a moment's hesitation or a single ounce of genuine sentiment. There was no loyalty clause in this unwritten contract, no retirement package, no gold watch for years of service, just a quiet, or sometimes very public, dismissal when a newer, shinier object caught your lord's eye. Your role was essentially that of a temporary, high-end commodity, and like all commodities, you had a shelf life. And that shelf life was directly tied to your aesthetic appeal. The moment you ceased to be the most visually appealing option on the market, your tenure was effectively over. And what, pray tell, awaited our aging, obsolescent mistress? Oh, just the delightful prospect of destitution in old age. Remember, she had no dower, no pension, no legitimate family to fall back on, no independent wealth to cushion her decline. The jewels and silks she once flaunted likely sold off piece by piece to keep a roof over her head and food in her belly. Many ended up in abject poverty, reduced to begging, or forced into the ultimate degradation, prostitution, selling the last vestiges of their faded beauty for a pittance. Others became reliant on sporadic charity, often from religious institutions that simultaneously condemned their past life while offering a grudging, minimalist succor. It was a bleak, terrifying future, devoid of comfort, dignity, or hope. So, while she might have once graced the finest halls and worn the most exquisite finery, her later years were often marked by a terrifying solitude. Without a legitimate family, without the societal safety net afforded to wives and widows, old age was often a solitary, terrifying prospect. She had alienated her own family, garnered the scorn of legitimate society, and outlived the fleeting affection of her lover. She died alone, her past glories fading into forgotten whispers, her beauty ravaged by time and disease. It was the ultimate, cruel irony. A life spent seeking connection and provision, ending in utter isolation and destitution. Imagine being a celebrity who fades from the public eye, but without the residual wealth or the ability to quietly reinvent yourself. This was worse. Far, far worse. The medieval mistress was caught in a particularly brutal version of a beauty pageant, where the prize was temporary luxury and the penalty for losing was absolute ruin. Every wrinkle, every gray hair, every slight change in her figure was a ticking clock, counting down to her inevitable, terrifying obsolescence. And unlike a fine wine, she did not improve with age. She simply became less useful, less desirable, and infinitely more vulnerable to the crushing weight of a society that had no use for her once her primary asset had withered. It was a future etched in the grim, unforgiving lines of time, a future that promised only coldness, hunger, and profound loneliness. Now, for those mistresses who managed to climb a little higher on the social ladder, perhaps even catching the eye of a powerful duke or king, a new and even more terrifying layer of misery was introduced, becoming a political pawn. Because powerful men, never ones to waste a resource, sometimes used their mistresses for far more than just companionship. They were strategic assets, tools in a Machiavellian game of power, influence, and subterfuge. They could be used as spies, their proximity to powerful men and their wives making them privy to secrets. They could be used as bargaining chips in alliances, their favors exchanged for political gain. Or they could simply be a highly visible, very expensive projection of a man's wealth and virility. But in all cases, they were never truly their own person. And like any good tool, once their political utility was exhausted, they were often discarded, imprisoned, or even re-gifted to another lord, like a used but still presentable carriage. Imagine being traded like livestock, passed from one powerful man to another, your opinions and feelings utterly irrelevant. You were not a human being with agency. You were a piece on a chessboard, moved at will by unseen hands, sacrificed when expedient, utterly expendable in the grand scheme of things. Your life, your body, your very future were all subject to the strategic calculations of men who viewed you as nothing more than an instrument to achieve their political ends. You were a very expensive, very temporary gadget, and when the new model came out, or when your battery died, you were simply replaced. This also meant you became a glaringly obvious weak point for rivals. An enemy of your lover didn't need to attack him directly, they could attack him through you. You were an open flank, a vulnerability ripe for exploitation. You could be targeted for blackmail, for sabotage, for public humiliation designed to discredit your lover. Imagine the constant paranoia, the never-ending fear that any misstep, any whispered secret, any perceived transgression could be used against the man who was your sole protector, and therefore against you. You were living under a microscope, every action scrutinized, every word potentially a weapon in someone else's hands. It was like being a minor celebrity who dates a politician. Everything you do becomes a potential headline and a liability. And through all of this, there was an absolute, terrifying lack of agency. You were never your own person. You were always a piece in someone else's Machiavellian game, a pawn moved across the board, never the player. Your desires, your dreams, your very sense of self were subsumed by the role you played in your lover's life. You might have had influence, yes, a subtle power in the shadows, but that influence was always contingent, always borrowed, always temporary. It was not your own. You could whisper in a king's ear, but you could not command an army. You could sway a decision, but you could not enact a law. You were perpetually secondary, perpetually dependent, perpetually a means to an end. It was a high-stakes, high-stress game, and you were playing with living pawns, your own life and body included, and the rules were never in your favor. Now, you might be thinking, but what about the royal mistresses? Surely they had it better. And it's true, on the surface, the king's bed offered a significantly softer landing than, say, a merchant's squalid backroom affair. They enjoyed elevated status, often immense wealth, and sometimes even considerable political influence, whispering directly into the ear of the most powerful man in the kingdom. They lived in castles, wore finery that would make modern fashionistas weep, and wielded power that could change the course of history. But here's the kicker. They still lacked legal standing. Their children were still bastards. It was a slightly gilded cage, certainly, but a cage nonetheless, and often far more dangerous than the humbler variety. Because with immense power came intense public scrutiny. Every move a royal mistress made, every word she uttered, Every dress she chose was scrutinized, criticized, and often used against her by her rivals, the queen's faction, and a perpetually moralizing populace. You were not just a private individual, you were a public spectacle, a living symbol of the king's perceived moral failings. Your lavish lifestyle, funded by the public purse, was a constant source of resentment. You were like a modern reality TV star. But instead of just social media trolls, you had actual noble families plotting your downfall and a church actively condemning your soul. It was a spotlight that could just as easily burn as illuminate. And here's where the higher the harder principle truly comes into play. The dramatic fall from grace for a royal mistress was often far more brutal and precipitous than for her lower status counterparts. While a minor lord's mistress might simply be cast out to relative obscurity and poverty, a king's mistress faced imprisonment, exile, or even execution upon the king's death or loss of favor. Think of Agnes Sorel, mistress to Charles VII of France. She was showered with wealth and influence, granted lands and titles, then died mysteriously, possibly poisoned. See, I told you this wasn't romantic. Even the winners got a suspicious tummy ache. Or Alice Purrs, mistress to Edward III of England, who accumulated vast wealth and influence only to be impeached, banished, and stripped of her assets after the king's death. The ultimate "what goes up must come down" cautionary tale, but with significantly more suffering and public humiliation. So while their lives might have glittered with gold and power, it was a different kind of misery. Less about destitution and more about intense pressure, relentless political maneuvering, and constant, mortal danger. They lived in a viper's nest of intrigue, where every friend could be an enemy, every ally a potential betrayer, and every success a reason for someone else to plot their downfall. They might have dined on roasted swans and drunk the finest wines, but the taste of fear was always on their tongue. They were powerful, yes, but their power was borrowed, precarious, and utterly dependent on the fickle affections of one man and the ever-shifting sands of court politics. Their cage was gilded, but the bars were just as strong, and the potential for a gruesome end was often higher. Now, let's explore the deliciously murky waters of medieval female companionship and its myriad labels. Because while we're focusing on the mistress, it's crucial to understand that the lines between a mistress, a high-class prostitute, and a less formal concubine were often incredibly blurry, not just in terms of social perception, but in their actual lived reality, and, critically, their legal rights. Imagine a Venn diagram of social opprobrium, and all three roles are pretty much piled on top of each other in the "definitely going to hell" section. The distinctions were often more about the duration of the arrangement and the perceived social status of the man involved than any fundamental difference in the woman's agency or rights. There was, perhaps, a subtle, almost imperceptible social hierarchy of ill repute. A courtesan might imply a woman of greater education, perhaps skilled in music and conversation, catering to a wealthy clientele for an evening or a short period. A concubine might be a more permanent fixture in a man's household, particularly in societies where polygamy was practiced or tolerated, often an enslaved or captured woman with absolutely no rights. A mistress, as we've discussed, was typically a long-term, non-marital relationship with a powerful man. But strip away the fancy titles, the silks, the pleasantries, and what do you find? Women exchanging companionship, sexual services, and sometimes even political influence for protection, provision, and a temporary elevation above destitution. The core transaction and the underlying vulnerability remained largely the same. And that's the common thread that ran through all these roles, binding them together in a tapestry of precariousness. Regardless of the specific label, the fundamental lack of legal protection, societal respect, and true autonomy remained constant. Whether you were called a courtesan, a concubine, or a mistress, you were, in the eyes of the church and legitimate society, a woman living in sin. Your body, your time, your future were largely not your own. You were an object of desire, a source of pleasure, a status symbol, but rarely, if ever, a fully recognized human being with inherent rights and dignity. It was a sliding scale of vulnerability, perhaps, but never a scale that tipped towards genuine security or respect. Even with greater wealth, education, or access to power, the fundamental sin and the social ostracism persisted. A high-born courtesan might be able to read Latin and discuss philosophy, but she was still morally condemned. A wealthy concubine might live in luxury, but she was still property. A royal mistress might influence a kingdom, but she was still a branded woman. No amount of worldly comfort or intellectual acumen could wash away the stain of her perceived moral transgression in the eyes of medieval society. The judgment was unwavering, the condemnation absolute, and the social penalty unavoidable. So, while the window dressing might have changed, the core experience of shame, precariousness, and spiritual damnation remained a grim constant across the entire spectrum of ill repute. It was a harsh, unforgiving world, and no amount of clever rebranding could change that. Now, let's wade into the truly terrifying aspect of being a medieval mistress, one that permeated every waking moment and haunted every sleeping hour: the unwavering, omnipresent condemnation of the church. In a deeply religious age, where the fear of God and the certainty of eternal damnation were as tangible as the stone walls of a castle, being a mistress was not merely a social faux pas, it was a mortal sin, plain and simple. The church's stance was uncompromising, absolute, and relentless. No amount of fine silks, no amount of a lord's favor, no amount of worldly wealth could save her immortal soul from the fiery pits of hell. This wasn't just about earthly discomfort, this was about the eternal agony of damnation. The constant threat of excommunication loomed large, a spiritual sword of Damocles. To be excommunicated meant to be cut off from the sacraments, from the community of believers, from the very grace of God. It was spiritual death, a public declaration that you were beyond salvation. Imagine being told daily that your very existence was an affront to the divine, that your soul was already forfeit, that every single sin you committed would be counted against you in the most excruciating detail. This was a form of psychological torture, a constant, internalized guilt that gnawed at the edges of her sanity. Even if she outwardly scoffed, the deeply ingrained religious belief of the age would likely ensure that the seed of doubt, the terror of hellfire, always remained. And should she seek repentance or be forced into it by societal or familial pressure, the path was often paved with humiliation. Confession and penance for a mistress were rarely private affairs. She might be forced into public penance, enduring public humiliation, walking barefoot through the streets, or wearing a penitential sackcloth, a stark contrast to the finery she usually wore. Imagine the collective gaze of the very society that condemned her, now watching her perform her penance, a spectacle of shame and degradation. This wasn't just about seeking forgiveness. It was about public shaming, about reinforcing the moral order, and about making an example of her. It was designed to break her, to inflict overwhelming, internalized guilt, a constant reminder of her sinful state. This pervasive fear of divine retribution was a powerful, ever-present force, not just for the mistress, but for the entire society that condemned her. Every famine, every plague, every military defeat, every minor mishap could be interpreted as a sign of God's wrath, spurred by the presence of such sinners in their midst. The mistress wasn't just jeopardizing her own soul, she was a visible, tangible reason why God might be smiting the entire community. This added another layer of public resentment and fear, making her not just a moral outcast, but a potential harbinger of doom for everyone around her. She was literally a walking, breathing curse in the eyes of many. And finally, the relentless sermons of doom emanating from every pulpit reinforced her unholy state and the grim fate awaiting her in the afterlife. Week after week, she would be subjected to fiery denunciations of illicit relationships, vivid descriptions of hellish torment, and stark warnings against the temptations of the flesh. These weren't abstract theological debates, they were direct, personal attacks aimed squarely at women like her. She was reminded, constantly, that her love was not love, but lust, that her gifts were not blessings, but bribes from Satan, that her life, however luxurious, was merely a prelude to eternal damnation. It was a psychological gauntlet designed to break the spirit, to ensure that even in the softest silks, she felt the burning heat of hellfire licking at her heels. Now, let's address the elephant in the meticulously embroidered room: the choice of becoming a medieval mistress. Because for many, if not most, women in this unenviable position, it wasn't a choice in any meaningful, modern sense of the word. It was often a stark, brutal reality, the best bad option between destitution, a forced, loveless marriage to a man far beneath her in status, or far above but equally repugnant, or the limited, cloistered life of a nun. Imagine a menu of misery, and mistress was simply the one that offered a slightly better chance of not starving to death immediately. It wasn't liberation, it was survival. Economic desperation was a relentless, unforgiving master. For a woman without a dowry, without family connections, without skills that could earn her a living in a patriarchal world, options were terrifyingly scarce. Her choices were often reduced to prostitution, begging, or entering into an informal arrangement with a wealthy man. The promise of food, shelter, and a degree of security, however precarious, could easily trump moral qualms or personal desires when starvation was knocking at the door. It was less a decision to pursue a romantic liaison and more a desperate tactical maneuver to avoid an even worse fate. You weren't choosing a lifestyle, you were choosing to stay alive, preferably with a roof over your head that didn't leak quite so much. Furthermore, let's not discount the profound impact of coercion and manipulation. Women, particularly young and vulnerable ones, might have been manipulated, seduced with false promises, or outright coerced into such positions. A powerful lord had immense leverage. He could offer protection, opportunities for her family, or simply use his status and charisma to overwhelm a young woman with limited life experience. The notion of consenting adults in an age of such vast power imbalances is, frankly, a historical absurdity. She might have had little real power to refuse, especially if her family encouraged it for their own gain, or if saying no meant immediate and dire consequences. Her choice was often made under immense pressure, with limited information, and with terrifyingly few alternatives. And once she was in, there was no ladder, only a cliff. There was no career progression, no way to improve her lot beyond the precarious whim of her lover. There was no path to independent security, no gradual accumulation of wealth or status that was truly her own. She was trapped on a precarious tightrope walk over an abyss with no safety net below. Her entire existence was defined by her relationship with one man, and the moment that relationship ended, she faced an immediate plunge into destitution and social ruin. There was no promotion, no retirement, no independent future to look forward to, just the constant dread of the inevitable drop. Her life, her identity, her future, they were always defined by and dependent on a man. She was never truly her own person. Her value, her status, her very existence were all reflections of her lover's power and caprice. She was an extension of him, a decorative appendage, a temporary convenience. She never truly got to define her own path, make her own decisions, or build a life that was genuinely her own. Her agency was constantly eroded, her selfhood subsumed by the demands and desires of another. It was a life lived in a perpetual state of secondary existence, a constant reminder that her world was not her own and could be taken away at any moment. Now, to truly hammer home the sheer, unadulterated misery of this existence, let's pull back the dusty veil of history and look at some of the lucky ones, the royal mistresses, the women who supposedly had it all, because even for them, the ending was rarely a fairy tale. Take Agnes Sorel, for instance, mistress to Charles VII of France in the 15th century. She was beautiful, intelligent, and wielded immense influence over the king. She was granted lands, titles, and became the first officially recognized royal mistress in France. She even had her portrait painted. How romantic, you might think. But then, at the height of her power, pregnant with her fourth child by the king, she died mysteriously at the age of 28. See? I told you this wasn't romantic. Even the winners got a suspicious tummy ache. While the official cause was dysentery, rumors of poisoning abounded. Even with a king's favor, her life was cut short, possibly by jealous rivals. A glittering life, yes, but one that ended abruptly and under a dark cloud. Then there's Alice Perrers, mistress to Edward III of England in the 14th century. This woman was a force of nature. She accumulated staggering wealth, lands, and influence, openly flaunting her position at court. She was powerful enough to intercede with the king on behalf of supplicants, and even sat on the judge's bench. A true medieval power player, right? But after the king's death, the tides turned with brutal swiftness. She was impeached by Parliament, banished from court, and stripped of virtually all her assets. All that carefully accrued wealth, all that influence, evaporated like morning mist. It's the ultimate what goes up must come down tale, a stark reminder that power gained through illicit means was incredibly tenuous. Her life serves as a brutal historical lesson. When your only asset is the king's ephemeral affection, you are on incredibly thin ice, and the moment that ice cracks, you plunge into the icy depths of destitution and disgrace. And finally, consider the tragic tale of Jane Shore, mistress to Edward IV of England in the late 15th century. Renowned for her beauty and charm, she was a popular figure, known for her wit and kindness. While the king lived, she enjoyed a privileged position and used her influence for good, helping those in need. But after Edward IV's sudden death, and with the ascent of Richard III, who was, let's face it, not known for his sunny disposition or tolerance of his brother's former lovers, her world collapsed. She was accused of witchcraft, forced to do public penance dressed only in her shift, carrying a taper through the streets of London. Stripped of her wealth and protection, she was later imprisoned and eventually died in poverty, a stark warning against the ephemeral nature of royal favor. One minute you're dining with the king, the next you're parading half-naked through the streets, enduring the jeers and judgment of the very populace who once admired your beauty. These aren't isolated incidents, my friends. They are recurring patterns, historical echoes that underscore the fundamental precariousness and inevitable downfall that awaited even the most successful, most influential mistresses. For every Agnes, Alice, or Jane whose name we remember, there were thousands of forgotten women who met even grimmer ends, their lives fading into historical obscurity, their names unrecorded. Their stories are not tales of triumph, but cautionary sagas, illustrating that a life built on a foundation of fleeting affection and borrowed power was a house of cards, always one ill wind away from collapsing into utter ruin. These women were the exceptions that proved the rule. Being a medieval mistress utterly, definitively sucked. Now, let's tackle the persistent myth, the romanticized delusion that sometimes, just sometimes, a medieval mistress might snag a happy ending. Because, let me be blunt, the concept of a good end for a medieval mistress was about as common as a functioning sewage system in a 13th century castle, which is to say, exceedingly rare, if not entirely mythical. The historical record is a vast, desolate landscape of precariousness, abandonment, and destitution, occasionally dotted by a glimmer of fleeting favor that almost inevitably ended in tears or worse. The idea of marriage to the lover was one such romantic fantasy. Surely, if his wife died, he'd marry her, you might protest. Exceedingly rare, darlin', exceedingly rare. While it did happen on occasion, usually only after the legitimate wife conveniently died and left a vacant seat, such a marriage was still almost always met with profound social scorn and legal challenges from the dead wife's family, who saw their lineage dishonored and their potential inheritance threatened. The new wife, formerly the mistress, would forever carry the stain of her past, her children still viewed with suspicion. It was less a blissful union and more a grudging capitulation to circumstance, often still fraught with social ostracism and the lingering resentment of legitimate society. A happy ending built on a graveyard of social expectations and the very real tomb of a previous spouse. And what about a comfortable retirement? A quiet life of dignity and ease, funded by years of loyal service. Almost unheard of. Such a scenario would require robust, legally ironclad provisions in a will, meticulously drawn up and successfully defended against the legitimate heirs who would, quite rightly, view any such inheritance as an affront and a theft. And even then, wills could be contested, promises broken, and the fickle winds of fate could easily blow away any semblance of security. Most mistresses simply faded into destitution. Their brief moment in the sun replaced by a long, cold twilight of poverty and neglect. There was no HR department, no pension scheme, no kindly union looking out for their golden years. Just the harsh, unforgiving realities of a society that had no place for them once their primary usefulness had expired. In fact, the vast majority of medieval mistresses simply vanished from the historical record, a testament to their ultimate lack of importance or lasting impact beyond their temporary role as a man's companion. They lived, they loved, they suffered, and then they disappeared, their names forgotten, their stories untold. Their existence was a footnote, a minor detail in the grand narrative of their powerful lovers, a shadow that briefly crossed the stage before fading into oblivion. This historical invisibility is perhaps the most eloquent testimony to their ultimate vulnerability and disposability. They were not just forgotten, they were never truly remembered in the first place, their lives deemed insignificant by the chroniclers of the age. So, why do we continue to romanticize this utterly bleak reality, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary? Perhaps it's the allure of forbidden love, the fantasy of defying societal norms, the seductive glimmer of power acquired through unconventional means. We project our modern desires for agency and romance onto a past that simply didn't accommodate them for women in such a position. We cling to the notion that love conquers all, even when history screams that it very rarely did, especially when property rights, social standing, and the omnipresent threat of damnation were involved. The enduring myth of the glamorous, triumphant mistress is a comforting lie, a pleasant historical fiction that allows us to ignore the truly harrowing, utterly miserable truth. But now you know better. And knowing, as they say, is half the battle. The other half is fighting the urge to go to sleep from all this bleakness. All right, my weary travelers, we have reached the end of our historically accurate, deeply depressing journey. We've walked through the muck and misery, dodged the flung chamber pots of societal judgment, and stared into the abyss of legal non-existence. So, let's do a rapid-fire, sarcastic recap of all the ways it utterly sucked to be a medieval mistress. Ready? No rights. No respect, no legal claim to your children, high chance of syphilis, constant social ostracism, the wife might literally stab you, your kids are branded as bastards, you'll probably die in poverty, you're a political pawn, and for all of it, the church promises you an express ticket to eternal damnation. Sound fun? No? Good. Because it wasn't. We have meticulously dismantled, piece by agonizing piece, any lingering romantic notions you might have harbored about this role. The silks were a gilded cage, the jewels a diamond collar, the influence a borrowed illusion, and the love a terrifyingly precarious gamble. This wasn't a choice. It was a desperate strategy for survival, a tragic consequence of a patriarchal society that offered women terrifyingly few alternatives. The medieval mistress was a beautiful, disposable object, a temporary convenience, destined for a life of fear, stigma, and almost inevitable ruin. So, if the thought of plague, social ostracism, the complete lack of basic human rights, and the ever-present threat of a vengeful wife hasn't quite put you to sleep yet, well, you're a trooper, a remarkably resilient, slightly masochistic trooper. But now you know the truth. You understand that beneath the veneer of courtly intrigue and lavish gifts lay a deeply unfair, terrifyingly vulnerable existence. You now know that the reality was far less fairy tale and far more horror show. Thanks for enduring this historically accurate, utterly miserable journey. May your dreams be filled with far less pestilence, far more legal standing, and absolutely no vengeful wives wielding sharp objects. If you've managed to stay awake through this entire historical deep dive into profound human suffering, consider subscribing. Or don't. History doesn't care, and neither, frankly, do I. Good night.